Okay, great. Well, first I would like to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you for coming to our panel discussion. And good morning to everyone that are online and joining us. I hope that this Wednesday greeted you with so much warmth and smiles. My name is Mariah Martin, and I will be moderating this panel discussion today entitled Censorious Assaults on Education and Collateral Impacts on Student Press Freedom. I would like to thank UNESCO, UNESCO's Youth Newsroom, the Academic Conference, Student Press Law Center, for offering their unwavering support to raise awareness of the pressing issues faced by student journalists, especially women journalists of color. I sit here today as a U.S. Free Expression Program Fellow at PEN America. PEN America is a part of an international NGO dedicated to the intersection of human rights and literature. And we support and offer resources for artists, activists, journalists, and most of all, just people who are dedicated to raising awareness to some of the issues that are most pressing for us. I currently am facing the alarming truth that many have been echoing throughout this week about the fragile state of our practice. Unfortunately, visibility for brown people of color, particularly women of color, are one that, how do I say this in the most polite way? That should be alarming to everyone. Better words to say it. So I'm proud to highlight that this panel today, we are all women of color and we are all student journalists. So that should be a round of applause right there. That is a monumentum. It's a wonderful occasion, and I'm happy to be here and happy to chair this conversation. The fragility of student press freedom is at a breaking point that is unprecedented. As stated by many this week, an attack on press is an attack on democracy. And we are currently experiencing extreme levels of infringement among students, journalists, and teachers never seen before in my lifetime. And I'm 27, so that's 2 decades. Between January and September of 2021, 24 legislators introduced 54 separate bills to restrict teaching and training in our schools, both K through 12 and higher education. Those bills censored and in most cases prohibited discussions of race, racism, gender, and sometimes the darker times of American history from existing in our workplace and our classrooms. These educational gag orders silence educators and activists who are tasked with educating our now generation on the unsolicited and unabridged truth about the people's history. This most recently is seen in the US, in Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, that has shaken the LGBTQIA community, legislation that suppresses critical race theory curricula, that ratifies BIPOC history, especially the atrocities done to people of African descent, and second to only the indigenous population in our country. We are also seeing book bans that infringe on open and free education for students and teachers, and their ability to encourage literacy of the English vernacular and all of its dialects, and the academic practice of humanities. In the United States, from January 1st, 2021, to March 31st, 2022, PEN America has listed 1,586 instances where books were banned, affecting 1,145 unique book titles, including 874 different authors, 198 illustrators, and 9 translators, impacting 1,081 artists. And the list elongates by the month. Student press freedom resides in the crosshairs of these infringements and are tasked with the responsibility to inform students and communities on these issues and also report on these infringements that affect the right to free expression, free opinion, free press, and the ability to educate our students on the truth. These censorious assaults leave student journalists as sitting ducks, Our viability and visibility, or the lack thereof, will be the rooting principle in our discussions today. And I'm so happy to be chairing this conversation. And we have 3 lovely young ladies here with me today. To my left, I have Sasanda Nkola. Did I say that correctly? Almost? Correct me, please. Nkwala. Yes. Sasanda Nkwala from South Africa. She is a senior lecturer in the media department. She's a faculty of the informatics and design department at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. To my right, I have Meghana Guntur, so sorry, from India, and she is a participant in the UNESCO's World Press Freedom Day Youth Newsroom, which is actually right next door, and a student at St. Anne's College, so thank you for coming. And then online, we have our wonderful, she'll pop up, Pratika Katiyard. Thank you so much. You're the best. From the US, and she is the former editor-in-chief for TJ Today and the current student co-chair at the Student Press Law Center. So thank you all for coming. I'm super excited to be here, and we're gonna get started on our first question. And I would like for each of you to briefly talk about yourself and where you are from, your experiences as a student journalist and a student educator, and an educator as well, and what roles have you held, and what has excited you about being a student journalist in your country and supporting student journalism in your country as well. Who'd like to go first?
So hello everyone, I'm Sasanda Nkwala. As our moderator Mariah told you, I am from South Africa, and I have a background as a journalist and also a student journalist, and I currently am an educator of journalism students. I think giving a picture of student journalism in South Africa, listening to what you were describing, Mariah, it really sounds like an experience we've had in the past as South Africa, where there was censorship, certain things couldn't be published. Thankfully, the landscape has changed dramatically since we attained our democracy in 1994. And I think our student journalism sector is quite a vibrant one, although mainly focused on campus issues and what is happening within, universities and directly what is happening with students. We really saw the student voice come to the fore in 2015, 2014, till about 2017, when we had nationwide protests to decolonize our higher education system. And the student press were really at the forefront of articulating the students' requirements and demands best, because firstly, they were students and they could understand exactly what the calls for the decolonization of higher education in South Africa were. But secondly, they because they are trained as journalists, they could then write in a way that would speak to society at large. So I think that was definitely, in our recent history, one of the defining moments that really brought to the fore the importance of student media. We have 2 kinds. So there is the in-house within the university campus category, and then we've also got radio stations that are licensed by the government, and those have to play by the rules that all media entities play by. I think the greatest threat to student journalism would be intimidation from authorities. So if they are covering a court case of a high-profile person, just like journalists in general, but I think because they would be young, because they may not be affiliated to a media house that commands clout, there may be intimidation, and that is definitely something that has a chilling effect, because if you see maybe a student journalist being harassed, you next time would not want to actually step out and cover those high-profile cases. But I think to conclude my remarks, definitely student journalism in our country has a role to play, and we've seen it with the fees must fall protest, which is what the calls to decolonize higher education were called. And I hope that just because that particular period is over, it doesn't mean that that student voice has died down.
That was beautiful.
Hey everyone, I'm Meghna Guntur and I'm from India. I'm a student from St. Anne's, but more than anything right now I'm nervous. Yeah, I have been studying journalism, literature and political science for 2 years now. And I've been writing since I was like pretty young, since school. And I think I started taking part in Model United Nations conferences since 8th grade. And I used to go as a delegate and represent certain countries. So I used to read up on their foreign policies and basically the information on those countries. And then I started going as a journalist. And I honestly just did it out of the passion for it. Little did I know that someday I'd actually attend a United Nations conferences. So this is awesome, actually. But yeah, when it comes to journalism in our country, as it's very widely known, India is such a diverse country. We've got various languages, dialects, cultures, traditions, and there is so much to talk about. So, of course, journalism is a very well-known profession there, but when it comes to studying journalism, when I took it up, a lot of people saw it as unconventional because not many people actually study journalism. Of course, maybe on a master's level, they study mass communication and everything. But at least in my group of friends, it was seen as a very unconventional subject to take up. I've actually worked dominantly for writing science and technology-based articles and communication under the same. But from time to time, every time I attended United Nations conferences, I've written about various committees and topics that were covered in those conferences. And I think I'm very excited to, take on this role because there is so much that people can learn from. And I don't know about elsewhere, but at least in our country, when you study arts, as I mentioned, it's seen as unconventional. So especially literature and journalism. So I'm really hoping that it would maybe carve a path for other people to take on such roles and to understand that there's so much you can do when you study such topics. Thank you so much.
Pratika is joining us online. So Pratika, this is your opportunity to answer our first question.
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Pratika Katiyar, and I'm from the United States. I grew up in Northern Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C., so I've always been really politically involved. But I'm currently in Boston, Massachusetts, where I attend Northeastern University. I'm studying business and communications. So I was a student journalist in high school. I graduated from Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, which is the #1 high school in the United States. And I was the former editor-in-chief of our student-run publication called TJ Today. As editor-in-chief, one of the important things that I did was cover my community and the surrounding community. I've been able to work with different types of student journalists over the past several years, and my work as a student journalist was very crucial. For example, I reported on demographic disparities in my high school, which was eventually linked in an article in the Washington Post. So this is just one example of the critical role that I think student journalists play in reporting on issues that are crucial to the community, even if they're potentially controversial. As a student journalist, I do enjoy lending my voice to professional outlets as well, because I always think a student perspective is very important. So for example, at the height of the COVID pandemic in the United States, I shared my perspective as a student journalist with outlets like USA Today and the Washington Post. And for my work, I was recognized as one of Virginia's Student Journalists of the Year. And that's just an honor that I take with me as a sign that my reporting is making a difference. Beyond journalism, as mentioned, I am an advocate and I work with the Student Press Law Center, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., focused on providing legal aid to student journalists, as well as the New Voices campaign. And I currently am on their board of directors as the youngest student member. So New Voices is a grassroots movement, which is across the United States, and it's focused on restoring First Amendment protections for student journalists. So over the past several years, I kind of used my experience as a student journalist to lobby for New Voices legislation in Virginia and also across the nation. So I testified for the bill in Virginia, and I have since advocated for student press freedom just across the nation by contributing op-eds, so using my journalism skills for advocacy and speaking for different panels, for example, like at Georgetown Law School recently, and also co-chairing Student Press Freedom Day, which is a nationwide day to honor student press freedom in the United States. So for my work, I was featured in Teen Vogue, NBC Washington, ABC, different news outlets, and it was important for me because I'm very passionate about press freedom and using my journalism skills as an advocate.
Thank you so much for that, Pratika. And that kind of leads us into our next question. What role do student journalists play within the media ecosystems within your country? Do your student journalists have independent media, or are they used, or commercial outlets used to support them? Anyone can start.
I think for the most part in South Africa, student journalists aren't really, like I mentioned earlier, a recognized category. They don't have press cards, so that kind of gravitas to be able to access certain spaces is something that they don't have. I think within how our curriculum is set up, in the third year, they get an opportunity to do internships at a recognized media house. And I think that is when they really step into their role as journalists outside of, reporting on campus matters, which is a pity because in how most journalism curricula are structured, even the work that they are doing, the kind of assignments and reports could be used and really be viewed as journalistic products. So I think the fellow panelist who spoke about some of the achievements she's been able to make because of her role as a student journalist being recognized within her country is something that unfortunately our students miss out on. So I think that is the biggest limitation that they have. But within campuses, student journalists are really active in advocating for the rights of students. And I mentioned the protests that really changed our higher education sector that was really articulated and stories were told through the student press. And then finally, we do have, like I mentioned, like our broadcast media, our campus radio stations that are part of the mainstream media ecosystem, which operates slightly differently to the in-house publications that a university would have.
Just a follow-up question. I know that in most academic higher education fields, they have academic journals where a lot of students use the opportunity to publish a lot of their findings. Have any of your students utilized those kind of platforms to showcase their journalism before that kind of third-year term?
I think within an institution, if it has a newspaper or if it's got an in-house magazine, that is where you would find students' work. But going beyond the comfort zone, I guess if I can call it that, of what is happening at an institution level, unfortunately, those kind of opportunities aren't there. And it's probably a conversation that our media sector needs to have. Because it's about creating opportunities for students to publish. Occasionally, when we've got a public holiday, like Youth Day, for example, they will reach out to student journalists to write newspaper articles, and that is when their work will be showcased. Also around election time, when they want to have the voice of the youth, our student journalists will produce maybe an insert on what's happening with young people, and that will go to our public broadcasting stations. But generally on a week-by-week or month-by-month basis, there aren't really platforms that are afforded to them until they get to that third-year level. And I think that also makes them not see themselves as a journalist until they graduate, which is a pity, because based on what happened with Fees Must Fall, definitely they've got the grounding that through their education, that even at a second year level, they would be at a level to produce good quality journalistic work.
Thank you. Pratika or Meg, would you like to go first? Pratika,
Yeah,
you can go, yeah.
Yeah, so student journalists in the United States have a very unique role as they fill in the gaps. So, as the local news crisis kind of deepens in the United States, with media outlets, kind of local media outlets, diminishing, and so that creates news deserts in which there are areas that lack coverage. So, student coverage becomes even more important because they cover not just their school community, but the surrounding community. So potentially controversial issues are being covered by student journalists. Students travel to protests. I know as a student journalist, I traveled and covered different protests, not just in my school, but because I went to school so close to Washington, D.C., things like the Women's March, I covered that in my reporting for my school publication. So with that, however, the increase of potentially controversial issues that students cover comes the increase for potential censorship or self-censorship. And in the United States, there are no blanket protections for student journalists, especially since the United States Supreme Court case ruling in 1988 with Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer. Student journalists are now subject to censorship from school administrators and authorities. So student press freedoms have been restrained. So while we're doing all this important work, covering potentially controversial issues and our school community, filling in those coverage gaps so that our audience is more aware, we do face these issues with censorship, self-censorship, and also pressures to not report on certain issues. And it's just limited the ability for student journalists to grow as professional journalists because, as previously mentioned, we are the next generation of journalists, and our work is so important in uncovering certain issues. And student journalism, as much as you would say professional journalism, is a pinnacle to democracy and is important in kind of holding authority accountable and just bringing different issues to light that wouldn't otherwise have been seen.
Thank you. Meg?
So I believe that students in any ecosystem, for that matter, bring in a fresh perspective to things. And of course, when it comes to media, I think that, student journalists would play a major role when it comes to education as well. And it's almost on a weekly basis that students and administrations have certain disagreements. And it's in such situations that a student journalist body would actually play such a major role in bringing visibility to an issue like this. I think the situation changes on a broader level though when it comes to student media on levels of specific regions. So of course there are newspapers or news outlets for every institution. They have their own sort of little media publication or student bodies which take on leadership roles, which also take on roles of student journalists. But when it comes to like a professional student media body, there actually isn't anything like that. And any role that's taken up like that, let's just say from Hyderabad, there are a few newspapers or student media bodies on social media. So these are done because they're passionate about it. So it comes out of passion and the need to actually spread visibility on certain issues. But when it comes to maybe internships or anything like that, students have to work for commercial outlets or already established institutions in order to actually gain professional experience on the same. But I think that it would actually be very good to have student medias by any institutions in specific regions, because everything that a student does brings so much of a fresh perspective, and there's so much we don't know on various levels that happens in different places, especially in a diverse country like India. So yeah, I think it would, not yet, but I'm sure someday it would really help to have something like a professional student media institution.
Yeah, I completely agree. As a educator and an activist and a journalist, it is like a very hard pill to swallow when there are just certain ways that you have to kind of facilitate different conversations, but because you are young, right? You have these social media outlets, you have the accessibility to these different platforms. It makes it very hard to kind of stay in the very strict lane that they kind of give us. So with that being said, what are some other restrictions that you are seeing within your countries that prohibit or kind of infringe on students' ability to give free press, and what are some ways in which you've seen students being censored?
We don't have particular laws that censor journalists in general and students in particular. But I think the fact that they are student journalists, for me, is one of the areas where maybe self-censorship or an educator censorship might come into play. And I'll speak for myself. With the courses that I teach, the students hand in their work through a YouTube channel. And in my role as an educator, I have certain obligations to the institution. So in their submissions, my encouragement is always that they give me an unlisted link and not put something out until I have vetted it, which may have the effect of making them hold back and not really tackle controversial issues because they think, oh, my lecturer is not going to like this, so let me not put it out there. So that kind of the student aspect, the fact that as a student you have obligations to the institution, first and foremost, and then to the field, which changes when you start your internship and you're now employed by a media house. I think that's one of the biggest ways that our students are sort of censored. It's not direct censorship, but that can come into play. And also if they have controversial things about the institution, that is something that we think about very carefully because they could be expelled. If you, and I know, we've had a lot of protests at our institution due to issues. And when students want to report on that and talk about what is going on with their peers, they have to bear in mind that depending on how they phrase whatever they are putting together, it could lead to them missing out and being expelled. And I think that then is a form of censorship because they must count or measure their words and the angles they take on stories. But in terms of the legislative framework, it's very free. Students can start a publication. Several of our institutions have established publications and established radio stations. It's just the student aspect that then can be a form of censorship.
Absolutely. As like a student activist, and I've been on campus, I've been at Temple University and doing protests and having that fear of like, okay, let me not say certain things because I still want to finish my degree. But you are pressed with that feeling of like, but no, I have to say something. So completely agree. Pratika or Meg, sure.
So as both of you mentioned, I think legally there's nothing that stops us from publishing or talking about anything. So strictly on a broad level with respect to legalities or even in practice, no one's going to restrict us from publishing anything, but we're obviously told to have a certain amount of discretion in the sense that when you are addressing something related to a specific person or something that is sensitive to a group of people, we're usually asked to avoid using something like that because you're taking on a huge amount of responsibility when you do the same. Because our level of freedom of expression is going to almost intrude another person's privacy, according to them. So I think there's two parties that play into this. So this is not so much censorship as advice, maybe, as to be very wise on what you decide to talk about. But I think in the sense that since again India is such a diverse country, some tradition or norm that applies to a certain community, and other community might not agree with, or something that a certain community speaks up on might hurt the sentiments of another community. So while you can please everyone, it still brings a sort of controversy when it comes to things like this. And this is when I think it is a threat to something you wish to publish, or pre-existing text in any sort of textbooks. When a certain group shows up and says, this hurts our sentiments, the first step taken in order to avoid any further controversy is to ban the text in question. Whether an inquiry or investigation is carried out later about the facts or opinions mentioned in that is a secondary thing. But the first thing they do is actually ban that. And that happens in most cases. So I think this brings about a certain question as to how much you can publish what you wish to, and whether you should or not. But I think in terms of, so as I mentioned, legally there's nothing like a censorship, but when it comes to societal pressures or cultural pressures, let's just take for instance topics of sex education or sexuality. At least in India, sex education or sexuality is seen as such a taboo, so they don't address it, which basically gives students the idea that you cannot talk about it. But as you learn that this is actually something that deserves visibility and you should talk about it, you do realize that because it wasn't taught to you by the right people, you learned it from other sources, say my friends, but they know just as much as I do. So this also leads to an amount of misinformation, which again questions what you wish to publish on the same. So I think certain societal or cultural differences maybe would bring about some sort of censorship. And yeah, that even on levels of, say, authorities in schools, let's just take for instance some incident of abuse or violence takes place. When students officially try to report something like that, authorities will automatically try to suppress it because they don't want to be held accountable for the same. So when they do that, this whole issue transforms onto social media. So they try to gain visibility on the same through social media. Now, of course, there are cases where this has happened and it has proved to be very helpful, and all these issues gain so much visibility. But in certain cases, they also try to achieve a certain level of virality. And since virality is seen as elusive, different kinds of versions of the same story go around. And if there's a victim in this situation, it is also such a problem to them, because it would not only are they going through the trauma of the experience, now there's different versions of their story and there's so much misinformation. So I believe that this, not legal, but maybe educational or cultural or societal levels of censorship do bring about certain amounts of wrong ideas or misinformation that actually really need to be worked on. But yeah, I mean, eventually there's so much that comes into play and so many technicalities and so many levels into it. So I think, yeah, that's basically how it is.
Yeah, social media can be a weapon, and it can also be our friend. And I think the sentiments that have been addressed like throughout the whole conference is that it's a landscape that's still ever changing, and we're still trying to get a grasp on it. And students are just more inclined to use it as a tool, but not educated on how to use it can also cause some other rift. So Pratika?
Yeah, so in the United States, there is the First Amendment that does protect freedom of speech and freedom of press. But since I mentioned earlier the Hazelwood ruling from the US Supreme Court, which is a landmark case, where the court ruled that student journalists could be subject to censorship from school administrators and authority. Since that ruling, student press freedoms have been restrained. And this ruling kind of limited the ability for student journalists to freely report on all issues, especially when it comes to potentially controversial ones. However, in different states in the United States, that policy can vary because state legislators still have the ability to instill protections for student journalists, and that's where New Voices comes in, which is what I talked about that I personally lobby for. New Voices is a movement that is in different states with legislation that is there to counteract the impact of the Hazelwood Supreme Court case. So as of this year, 15 states out of 50 have New Voices laws, which is restoring protections for what student journalists can report. However, beyond the statewide measures, the policies surrounding censorship vary by school district and even school. So in my high school, we did not have active censorship, meaning that we were free to cover different topics, but naturally, as with all student journalists, self-censorship is still a thing. But I am aware of nearby high schools that did practice censorship, where student journalists would write something for their yearbook or their newspaper, or even produce something for broadcast media. And administrators would say, like, no, you can't report this, you can't talk about this issue. And it wasn't even just issues related to the institution or the school, but it was issues related to the surrounding political, social climate. Beyond just censorship, though, like pure like laws that I guess enact censorship or don't, self-censorship is an issue that all student journalists face that we've talked about throughout the panel. All student journalists worry and grapple with what they can and cannot cover. Due to societal norms, student journalists are not always seen as mature when it comes to covering issues like climate change or racial equality. And due to the lack of protection that we have, we often opt to not cover these issues, even though they're very important to be covered for the community and for our surrounding community and for our school. For example, when I was editor-in-chief at my high school, there were certain things like, for example, we had a protest or a walkout related to gun violence that student journalists that I managed as editor would be uncomfortable with covering because of self-censorship, because of concerns of potential censorship, or worries that they may be seen as controversial, or just the societal cultural pressures that as student journalists, you aren't mature enough to cover these things. And this is a belief held by several lawmakers as well. I know that when I went to the Virginia House and I spoke to lawmakers, I saw that some in hesitancy would say that student journalists cannot cover like issues like mental health, which are so important to schools and communities, but because of this kind of societal nature or taboo topic, they aren't allowed to cover it. And as mentioned in the introduction, certain bills like the anti-critical race theory bills in the United States, or Florida's recent Don't Say Gay bill, which like would prohibit different concepts, and they directly impact teachers, but they also impact what student journalists are able to say because they are so vague and so broad, and they have like a blanket legislation over these topics. So there are certain things that student journalists have to work around in the United States. And I think one thing they have in common with student journalists from across the nation, across the world, is their inability to cover certain topics and sometimes worry about self-censorship.
Thank you so much for that. And we're wrapping up on time, so I'm going to compile the last two questions together. So we know that student journalists are facing some very unique threats, in particular student journalists who live on the intersections of identities, different genders, race, religions, and so on and so forth. And we know that they're dealing with harassment. And so what are some safety concerns that you are seeing in your countries, and what are some recommendations to kind of protect students who are facing these things? Anyone can go first.
So I think, as we spoke about it earlier, again, India is a diverse country. So I think representation on various levels matters, because of course there would be a question of how much does identity matter, but it is only when you identify yourself with a certain, say, race or caste or sexuality or gender, that helps others realize that, okay, if you are able to do that, I can too. And if you're able to do that in leadership roles or in a broader sense, it basically gives a certain assurance to a certain community. But as I mentioned earlier, the whole topic of sexuality or identities in general in India is still a topic that there's so much to cover and so much more to learn about and so much more to embrace on the same. But I think if there are any threats, of course, any journalist would have certain threats. Like I mentioned, if you report on a certain community, if the community has a certain amount of power, they will hold you accountable for the same, and they would wish for the repercussions, for you to face it, to face the consequences on speaking about the same. But I think when it comes to students, another thing they would probably face is that when you're a student, everything is still fresh. There's so much you know and so much you also don't know. So different students might identify with different groups of people or might relate to different types of news. So not only do you face a certain threat from, say, others, but also from your own peers at times, because you don't relate to the same things or you don't agree on the same things. So I think in a broader level of threats per se, I think it's important to know that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but opinions cannot be confused for facts, which usually happens. And that's what brings about threats to certain people, especially student journalists. And also, I think in terms of the fact that at times, say you report on a certain issue, and there might be things that you covered, and then there are things that you also didn't cover, because maybe every story has two sides. So the side that you haven't covered would want a certain level of visibility from their side as well. And now if you don't do a story on them, what are the repercussions you face on that? Because they'll be like, if that side of the story can have a certain awareness, why not this side? And there's so much that you need to cover. So I think the level of safety that must be established would be the same for any journalist, which is to understand that in the end of the day, a journalist's purpose is to bring visibility to issues, spread the truth, and talk about issues and assure people that they are heard and they will be voiced for. And you have to understand the role of journalists and the amount of responsibility that they hold and take action based on that. Of course, if someone is spreading fake news or if there's misinformation involved, that's a whole different agenda. But a journalist cannot be penalized for reporting the truth, which usually happens. And I think there is so much that needs to be established in order for journalists to be assured that just reporting the truth would not have any sort of repercussions for the same or any sort of consequences, because it is very much aware that journalists are tortured. They are also harassed online now, because just as fast as investigative journalism is possible through the internet now, that rate is directly proportional to the risks that come with it. So the faster you get information, the riskier it is for you to report it. So I think there's so much involved in fact-checking as well as reporting when it comes to a journalist, that it is very important for citizens in general or communities to understand that if they have reported a certain news and there is a lot of fact in that, you just have to understand that it is their job to report the truth and bring visibility. So I think awareness on the amount of work involved in being a journalist, and also awareness on the sort of trauma that they also go through while uncovering certain stories is so important to understand. And I think on an international level, only when there is a certain amount of time, counseling, and money invested in protecting journalists, that even student journalists would feel safe enough to come out and report issues and speak up on what they believe. So in the end of the day, I think if there's anything that needs to be done, it is, of course, you can train journalists on how to protect themselves, but you also have to train the general public as to what it is to be a journalist And even in terms of mental health and counseling, I think it's important to specifically educate counselors on journalism as a job, because it's not necessary that the trauma you face is only coming from conflict areas. You could report a natural disaster and still have a certain amount of trauma associated with it, because what journalists see and face in a lifetime is the truth, and the reality is often harsh. So it is very important to understand everything that a journalist goes through. So not only do you have to educate journalists as well as infrastructure for protecting them, but also the people as to what it is to be a journalist.
For me, I think in our context, there are 3 areas where student journalists, particularly based on race and gender, face threats. The first are the prevailing sexist views that result in how female student journalists are treated when they go for their internships. It's not uncommon for a student to report that they have been sexually harassed, and and often they do it in retrospect after they have left, and graduated, because at the time they didn't want to put the university in jeopardy and they wanted to graduate because they must do the internship. So that opens them up to greater levels of exploitation. Secondly, it's also related to the fact that our newsrooms in South Africa are facing a phenomenon of juniorization, where because of the shrinking investment in the news media sector in particular, interns are brought in to do the work of senior reporters, and that really places the interns at great risk. They are covering stories that are completely out of their depth, but they must deliver at the end of the day, and that has consequences for their mental health, even for their safety. So I think the phenomenon of juniorization is another big threat to student journalists, especially when they're doing their internships. And I think, as the fellow panelist mentioned, the third one is mental health. Because it's not factored into our curriculum currently as a really central part, when a student who has just finished their 3rd year and doing their internship goes into a newsroom, literally the first thing I know for me, when I stepped into a newsroom, the first thing I covered was a court case where somebody had murdered someone, and you have no concept of that. Nobody has prepared you for that, and you are thrown into the deep end, and you don't know how to process it because it's not something that you were taught. So the issue of mental health, I think, and the lack of focus on it in our curriculum is a big threat. In terms of recommendations, I think there are 3 that I would make. The first is for a body to be established in South Africa that really represents the voice of student journalists. I've mentioned the complexities that being a student and being a journalist poses for our student journalists. So such a body would be able to articulate the issues both within the university and within the journalism sector. I think secondly, inculcating in students from the onset that they are journalists. Yes, they are journalists in training, but I think because they feel like only in 3rd year, once they graduate, they can really step into that identity, they really hold back. And does my lecturer approve? Will this get me into trouble? But if it's something that is ingrained in them from the onset, that you are a student, but you are a journalist as well, I think it will go a long way into removing this or minimizing self-censorship. And then lastly, I think we need an exercise where institutions of higher learning are really taught about the concept of press freedom in our context. Our universities really, I don't think they fully appreciate what it means for students to be a press. And while they recognize the notion of freedom of expression in society broadly, because of restrictions and possible expulsion or bringing the university to disrepute, it doesn't translate into how they treat student journalists all the time. So an exercise in educating the institutions and letting them know that by virtue of being journalists, the students have a right to exercise their freedom of expression.
Agreed. You can go.
Of course. So I have a few different pieces of advice for dealing with safety concerns. In the United States, student journalists do cover several issues that can be potentially controversial. And as professional journalists, student journalists cover protests and other large demonstrations. So what's really important is knowing your rights, especially when it comes to covering protests. In the past couple of years, especially with the very tumultuous political climate in the United States, student journalists have been arrested. And it is important to understand what you can and cannot do, but also understand that it's important to be covering these things. Additionally, not being afraid with your reporting, using your voice to act as a watchdog or uncover things is the pinnacle of journalism. And as a woman of color, my identity is even more on display when I report on certain issues, but it doesn't impact my reporting, as I ensure that every story I write is airtight, and that includes the basics of journalism, fact-checking quote confirmations, following ethical guidelines when it comes to your reporting. This won't prevent people from picking apart your stories. That always happens, because as a journalist, you're putting the truth on display and you're bringing issues to light that people would otherwise not want to or be able to see. And so making sure your reporting is bulletproof is the one thing you can do and the one thing you have control over. I remember I wrote an op-ed once on press freedom, and it received hateful or disagreeing comments. And that was my opinion. And that reporting did unfortunately receive those comments, but it didn't deter me from continuing to write op-eds speaking my opinion. But it is also important to differentiate opinion from facts. And that's why, as part of my recommendations, I think media literacy training across the world is so important, especially with the growing presence of social media. Journalism is everywhere now. It's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, as much as it is online or still in print. But having media literacy, finding out what's real, what's misinformation, will continue to grow in importance. Additionally, having support for journalists nationwide in the United States, but also around the world. So in the United States, I think for student journalists specifically, that means continuing with New Voices legislation, continuing to have each state protect and restore First Amendment protections for student journalists. But in the international community, I think that means recognizing the important role that all journalists have. You can't appreciate student journalism if you don't appreciate journalism as a whole. And journalists across the world still face threats to their safety, to their lives, based on just the reporting they do. And I want to echo the sentiment of the other panelists by saying that mental health is very important for student journalists and journalists because of the sheer amount of things that they see, the reporting that they do, the level of seriousness and graveness that they have in the reporting, because the issues that they cover, while some of them might be light, some of them most of the time aren't. And so having support in place for journalists and being able to give them something tangible to turn to if they're in need of help is very important. And just support lines for journalists. I know the Student Press Law Center that I work with has free legal aid for student journalists. That's especially important. All institutions should have legal aid for journalists because it's so important with the amount of scrutiny that journalists face in their reporting, and having international support for that will kind of help journalists reassure them and take it to the next level and inspire the next generation of journalists to continue using their voice to report on the truth.
Thank you so much. And I want to wrap up the session by speaking to our educator on the panel. And the spirit is in COFA. Is there anything that you would like to give advice to some student journalists about what they can do moving forward and just learning about some lessons from the past? Do you give any advice just on how we can keep the fight going?
I think I would say that, really embody your role. You, as a student journalist, have got a niche on a sector and, a particular demographic that working journalists don't. And you've got a perspective that isn't tainted by being out on the field for many years, that is fresh, that is courageous, that understands technology much better than some of our editors. And so stepping into that, I think, just from the onset, really will stand not just yourself, but your journalism industry, irrespective of the country that you're in good stead. I think we benefit from the voice of young people being amplified in society because of the way they see issues that seasoned journalists have grown so tired of. So step into your role as a journalist and, learn as you go, but be courageous enough to make those mistakes.
Wise words. I love that. So I wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you so much for everyone who is here and online who have joined us in this conversation. I encourage you all to look at some of the reports that PEN America has released about our educational gag orders, about our book ban list. Please look out for student journalism in your own state, in your own country. Support schools, newspapers, online platforms, and share as much as you can, because like you said, we are stepping into that role and we need our voices to be heard now more than ever. So thank you so much, everyone.